And you can hear me.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so we are set. Well,
We're set to go now, Nyna.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to share my mother's story with you. In today's world, we have to stay connected any way we can, right? Via Zoom. It's been such a difficult year for all of us, being disconnected, and it's more important than ever to pay attention to our mental health and that of those around us and stay connected. I wrote my book, The Bridesmaid's Daughter, to tell my mother's story, knowing that untreated mental illness was at the core. I wanted to uncover the truth to really understand and appreciate what she went through in a way that I could share with the world. In order to do that, I also had to face what happened to me as a child, which has been very painful to relive. It's been an incredible journey over 6 years, over 100 interviews, of meeting a family that I never knew, meeting with the top mental health professionals and the likes of Eileen Ford and Tippi Hedren. I've researched and documented my mother's entire modeling career, from Steubenville, Ohio, to New York City, to Monaco, and ultimately to the Royal Palace. I've retraced the footsteps of my mother's entire life. She had been a very successful Ford model in the late 1940s through the mid-1950s, best friend and bridesmaid to Grace Kelly. She worked with the most famous photographers. Later in life, she spent years living in a homeless shelter. How did this once glamorous woman fall so hard? I feel that I've been blessed to have the opportunity to honor my mother's life with this book, to solve the mystery of her life. But how many women's stories will never be told? How many women from my mother's era were misunderstood? I know that my mother's story is not unusual, save for the friendship with Grace Kelly. All the more reason why her story should be told to shine a light for others. I'd like to start by taking you back to 1989, when our family's ordeal first became public, and also the prologue of my book. The day my mother's story first slipped out into the world, I was 29 years old. It was March 1989, and I'd just dropped my daughter at her nursery school before driving over to my local supermarket to pick up groceries. My son was still a toddler, sitting in the shopping cart, kicking his little legs as he waited for me to pay at the checkout. I remember glancing down and smiling at him as I stood on the line. He was such a sunny and easy child. I looked forward to our time in the mornings together after his big sister went to school and before his midday nap. My husband and I lived with our 2 young children in a nice, comfortable house in a suburb of New York, the same town that he'd grown up in. I was a stay-at-home mom. I spent my days taking my children to play groups and nursery school. Our friends were my husband's college friends and their wives, people who knew almost nothing about my family or my past. I preferred it that way. I thought I could keep everything neatly in its place, the same way I cleared up the children's toys before my husband came home at the end of the day. That day at the supermarket, the one woman ahead of me in the checkout was still unloading her groceries from the cart. So I turned to glance at the magazines in the rack as I waited. And that's when I saw it. The cover, the headline on the cover of one of the tabloids. Princess Grace bridesmaid living in New York shelter for homeless, photo exclusive. I whipped around to make sure no one else had noticed. My face was on fire, my stomach tight. No one in my world knew about my mother, about the connection to Grace. Would they even guess the woman from the headline had anything to do with me? I grabbed a copy from the rack, tucking it under a quart of milk. Then as fast as I could, I paid for the magazine and the groceries and fled to the parking lot. In the quiet of the car, I opened the magazine, searching for my mother. There she was, on page 19. Gray circles under the hollows of her dark eyes and streaks of silver running through her cropped black hair. In the photograph, she was sitting on the steps outside the shelter where she lived, wearing a thick white scarf around her neck, pausing to place a small knitted hat on her head. For the most part, the article about her was accurate. My mother did sleep each night in a homeless shelter on the Upper East Side of New York. Her bed was number 85, with a small regulation blue blanket. Each morning at 7 a.m., the guard shook her awake and she got up and left the shelter, going to Bergdorf Goodman's department store to wash in the basins of the ladies' lounge, spending her days in the local parks, libraries, and churches. The part about Princess Grace was also true. My mother, Grace Kelly, and Grace Kelly had first met in New York in 1947 when they were living in next-door rooms at the Barbizon Hotel for Women. Grace was studying acting. My mother was modeling for Eileen Ford and had just arrived in New York from Ohio. After Grace became famous, the two women remained close. And when Grace married Prince Rainier in Monaco in 1956, my mother had been at her side as one of her bridesmaids. Sorry. Hang on. The article went on to explain that since Grace's death, Carolyn's story had taken a very different turn. Now, only a few years after Grace's fatal car accident, Carolyn was lonely and destitute, living in a shelter. What the article didn't say is that while my mother may have been lonely, she was not alone. She had family who cared about her, who tried to persuade her to seek help to find housing. Each month, I accepted her collect calls, and my husband and I paid a local diner so she could eat her meals there. I was the bridesmaid's daughter, and while I might not have told my friends and acquaintances about my situation and her situation, I thought about my mother all the time. I worried about her. I hoped that she was warm enough, left every time the phone rang, terrified something had happened to her. And as often as I could, I went into the city to visit her. My mother and I would sit in a little square set between buildings on West 58th Street, where she liked to sit and pray. She was religious, devoted to the Virgin Mary, and she believed the little square was blessed. I knew I could always find her there, sitting on a bench, her head bowed and her hands clasped in prayer. From a distance, no one would ever have guessed that my mother was homeless. As often as I could, I went into the city to visit her. Not a hair on her head was ever out of place. Proper appearance was always very important to her. She liked to wear white for purity, white slacks, white shirt, white scarf, white tennis shoes. Together, we'd go to a nearby diner for lunch, spending the next hour or so picking at our food and trying to make conversation. My mother used to like to talk about astrology. She was obsessed with the star signs and the movement of the planets. She'd say the planets are colliding this week. We have to be very careful. It's a dangerous time. She had a lot of advice. If I talked about my husband, she'd tell me I should leave him. If I brought up something about my children, she told me that I should take them to the doctor. She was worried about their health. She was concerned about me too. She wanted me to see a doctor. I didn't look well. We need a miracle. I've been praying for you. But when I talked to my mother and tried to talk to her about what we could do to improve her own situation, she'd shut me down. We'll talk about that when the sun is shining, she'd say. And that was that. She didn't want my help. More than anything, she seemed to want to be left alone. I had spent so long trying to separate myself from my mother, forging my own life in order to survive. I'd even changed the spelling of my name to set myself apart, spelling Nina with a Y. Now, as we sat on the opposite sides of the table at the diner, it was as if 1,000 miles stretched between us. During those lunches, we were careful to avoid eye contact. My mother looked off to either side, remaining alert to danger. I stared at my plate. I didn't want to catch my mother's eyes. If I did, I usually regretted it. She had the saddest eyes I'd ever seen. After lunch, I got back in the car and drove home to the suburbs, back to the careful, normal life I had built for myself, my fortress. My mother remained living at the shelter for a decade until 1998. At that point, she developed a heart problem, which meant she could no longer stay at the shelter. And we were able to move her to an adult home on Long Island. She spent the last years of her life at a nursing care center. Where she died at the age of 79. When my mother was alive, I never managed to learn what made her the way she was, why she was so removed from the world, how the once glamorous model and bridesmaid ended up sleeping each night in a shelter. It was only after she was gone that I was able to fully understand what happened, to go back to the past in search of the woman my mother had been before I was born, and to the childhood I'd lost after everything changed. The year I was born was a very difficult one for my mother. My birth was traumatic. My mother was a petite 5'4". I was a 10-pound, 10-ounce baby. She had a C-section, her third, and woke up to find out that she had also had a hysterectomy. She was in the hospital for more than a week. At that point, she had given up her career. She was isolated on Long Island, far from family and friends who would have noticed any change in her behavior. Everything my mother loved was in New York City. And my mother also found out that my father had an affair when I was just 9 months old. This created the perfect storm. She knew there was something wrong, and she was actually secretly trying to see a psychiatrist in the city. But when my father found out, he refused to pay for the visits, insisting that she see a psychiatrist of his own choosing, which she never did. When I was a teenager, my father told me that we would have hated him if he had committed her. So instead, I was hidden away with her. Mental illness affects not just the patient, but the family members, and in my case, had a profound effect on my development and upbringing. Part of my story is my lack of formal education. While in my mother's care, the only full year of education I had with no absences was 7th grade. In fact, I only attended 175 days of elementary school, the equivalent of one school year. My mother told me I had internal bleeding, a concept that terrified me. I grew up thinking I had a bad heart, rheumatic fever. In reality, I was fine, but my mother was not. Children won't say they have anxiety. They'll say my stomach hurts. We were trapped in this vicious cycle of dysfunction. Children need to feel safe at home in order to feel that the world is a safe place. Think of all the things a child would miss from not going to elementary school. No sense of accomplishment, no friendships, that sense of belonging and fitting in. I was never allowed to attend a gym class. I have no class pictures from that time. It wasn't until I was 10 that there was a petition for neglect, educational neglect. And even after that, I only attended 5 days of 5th grade and 0 of 6th grade. So many days I stayed home from school, resting in my bedroom. I spent my days reading and playing piano. News broadcasts helped to break up the day. I watched the news, even as a very young girl, on ABC religiously at 7 a.m., 5 p.m., and 11 p.m. A friend of my sister said, "You were like a beautiful porcelain doll, a non-entity. You never left your mother's side." The daughter of one of our neighbors on Long Island told me that she would often ride her bike by our house to see if she could catch a glimpse of me. We knew there was a strange girl who lived there, but she mostly stayed in her room because she was sickly. It was like a mystery. What was going on in there? In reality, it was my sister Robin who saved me when she asked the question, "Nina, do you know you were never sick all those years?" I was 14 at the time. The first time I actually talked to a therapist about my childhood, I was 35. And I'll never forget how exposed I felt in that first session when she asked, "Who do you see when you look in the mirror?" And I realized I had no identity. It has taken me years to accept what happened to me in the care of my mother and to find my voice. But I'm proud to say that despite the effect my mother's untreated mental illness had on my development and upbringing, I've had a really good life, and I have been able to separate my mother from her illness. I feel nothing but the most intense compassion and love for her today. And it's because of her that my life is so full of meaning right now. Years later, I did get my GED because in those days you did not want to be a high school dropout.
Well,
My youngest daughter, Danny, actually spent more time in a college classroom than I spent in a classroom my entire life. Given my lack of formal education, can you imagine for a moment what it meant to see my daughter graduate from college? Definitely one of the happiest moments of my life. It became very clear to me early on that my mission in life, was to honor my mother and her career as a model, to be proud of what she accomplished. That's something I really didn't get a chance to do when I was younger. Growing up, I knew very little about her professional success. She had lost her portfolio on a plane trip, and I never saw any of her modeling pictures until recently. Now I have about 600 images. In the 1950s, she was instantly recognizable by her face, if not her name. Carolyn Schaffner was a small town girl hailing from Steubenville, Ohio, who made it big. And as her cousin once said to me, the wonder and the magic of what she was experiencing was never lost on her. She's considered an icon of Steubenville, along with Dean Martin. Her hometown will soon launch a campaign to honor my mother with a mural. In 1947, Steubenville was celebrating the 150th year of its founding. The prettiest girl would be crowned sesquicentennial queen, and my mother won. As queen, she presided over all the sesquicentennial activities, riding on the biggest float of all, Her Majesty. Sorry about the noise, white noise. But that's her on the float. You can see that. From that, she was offered a prize, a cash prize, which she chose. She actually could have chosen to go to Hollywood for a screen test, but she chose the cash prize. And at age 19, she took the prize money, moved to the Barbizon in New York, where she met a young 18-year-old Grace Kelly. A few years later, Grace set my parents up on a blind date. She was actually the one to introduce them. Sorry, lost it. Okay. I spent endless hours in libraries like the Library of Congress, the New York Public Library, the Gladys Marcus Library at FIT, and many others, piecing together my mother's entire modeling career, including her very first magazine ads. These were in May and June in Mademoiselle and Glamour, some of her first full pages. This was her very first cover, McCall's. It was shot by a young Richard Avedon. And interesting to note, Avedon, his sister was diagnosed with schizophrenia as a teenager. And it was said that this influenced his career and desire to capture tragic beauty in photos. I'm very happy this photo, which Scavullo shot, became the back cover of the Bridesmaid's Daughter. I had it in mind for a long time, and I was really happy that my co-author and publisher agreed. It was shot by Scavullo and appeared in the November issue of 17 magazine in 1948, very early in my mother's career, and made even more poignant by the fact that Scavullo himself suffered with untreated mental illness, and for years before he received a clear diagnosis and treatment. This is the cover of Charm, which later became Glamour. That was shot by Mark Shaw. Eileen Ford referred to her as a golden girl, living that wonderful life and one of the most successful junior models she ever had. But how could I just be seeing these images for the first time? Now, this one was from the wedding, obviously, shot by Hal Conan. My mother also worked with Hal before the wedding, and then he became Grace's official photographer. And I thought, when I was doing all this research, who was this amazing woman? So confident, so poised, so radiant. Sadly, this was not the woman that I knew growing up. I kept searching for new insights and more information, but as hard as I tried to put the pieces of my mother's life back together, there were some pieces that just didn't fit. I knew that in order to fully understand her story, I needed to figure out the point at which she first began to show symptoms of her illness. From my reading of paranoid schizophrenia, I knew that in the vast majority of cases, symptoms of the illness begin in late adolescence or early 20s. But when I met with my mother's friends, family members, nobody mentioned anything, nothing unusual until after I was born. By then, she was 30 years old. So was it typical for someone with schizophrenia to have such a late onset? Very grateful to my friends actually at Columbia that I was introduced by people from Westchester that I knew, but they just connected me to the best person ever, Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman, who's chairman of psychiatry at Columbia. And I hoped, because he had done the largest research study on schizophrenia, that he would be able to answer my questions. And that meeting marked a pivotal moment in my journey. I told him as much as I could about my mother. I brought with him names of medications she had taken, explained, as much as I could to him. And it was just so obvious to somebody like that what I was really saying. He asked me questions. Did she suffer with insomnia? Did she smoke? Did she have a history of hypochondria, trauma in childhood, religious beliefs? I answered yes to all of his questions. And I explained that by the time she received her diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, she was in her 50s. He said the doctors there would have seen a woman who was delusional, so they made their diagnosis based on the symptoms she was presenting at that time. But they did not have any access to prior health records or history. And he said, your mother didn't have paranoid schizophrenia. What you've just described to me are the symptoms of postpartum psychosis. I was completely stunned. I knew nothing about it. It's a severe psychiatric condition that can set in during the first months after a mother gives birth to a child, and even more serious than the more common postpartum depression. I know that my mother never did anything deliberately to harm me. Her delusions that she suffered from seemed to be all related to my physical health and of others. It was not Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Sometimes people mention that. She wasn't making me sick. It was more like a hypervigilance and concern, over concern. He pointed out that she may have had these tendencies towards hypochondria and obsessive compulsive disorder even before my birth, but that postpartum psychosis would have exacerbated those tendencies, magnifying their effect. Today, it's so sad because it's considered temporary and treatable. If left untreated, however, the sufferer only continues to deteriorate, as my mother did. So the tragedy here is that she could have been treated. And if you look at this picture, you can see the difference. You see the happy woman smiling before my birth and just the difference in her afterwards. It's like the light is gone out of her eyes. It was an era when women didn't tell anyone if they were unhappy in their marriage or their struggles, certainly not anything about their mental health. It's no surprise that when my mother had me, there were no support groups. And when I had my 3 children, no one told me about postpartum depression or anxiety, just the baby blues. I actually spoke with a leading expert on postpartum psychosis, Diana Barnes, and she said as a model, her whole persona was about femininity and beauty. So it would have been particularly hard for her, referring to the hysterectomy. She would have felt as if she lost part of what made her a woman. She asked if my mother was sexually abused as a child. 6 people told me that they thought that she was molested by her stepfather, another risk factor and another reason why she left Steubenville. I consulted with my OBGYN. He said, after such a traumatic surgery, it's highly unlikely that your mother could have escaped some kind of postpartum depression. The doctor told me that because I was such a big baby, the massive incision would have limited her ability to breastfeed and bond with me. It would have been many weeks before the incision healed. So my birth was the fork in the road, the turning point in her life from which she never recovered through no fault of her own. So without realizing it, I've been an advocate since I was born. I understand mental illness from all sides. My mother was ill for as far back as I can remember. My oldest daughter, Nicole, is developmentally disabled and needs serious mental health services and support. And over the years, I've experienced my own anxiety and depression. And I just want to add here, the social isolation of the pandemic has been very triggering for me personally, because I grew up so so isolated, with a hyper-vigilant mother and worrying about, diseases and all of these things. And it's not easy for me to be the one speaking. This is way outside my comfort zone. But I found something that I care more about than the fear. The truth is, I'm just very passionate about mental health advocacy and sharing the story. This is a photo taken of when my mother was homeless in New York. She loved to draw animals, flowers, so she would take, that pad with her and just draw in the park. When my mother was in the Armory in 1985, there were 10,000 people in shelters in New York City. Now there are more than 58,000, and who knows what this next year is going to bring. A large percentage of them are mentally ill, but the system has failed. They should not be invisible to us. And this is what I know now. My mother was sick in her mind, not able to take care of herself and to make good decisions. She did not know she was sick and did not want treatment. The mental health laws prevent family members and doctors from treating people like my mother. By doing so, the mental health laws are not helping people and they're not protecting society. The legal standard for treating people is dangerousness to self or others, when it should be need for treatment due to incapacity. What my mother needed was an advocate, someone to take charge of her life and intervene at every level. At that time, I was so completely uneducated about the causes and effects of mental illness. I simply couldn't be that person on her behalf. I was in survival mode myself. I would give anything to be the person that I am today with what I know, to go back in time to help her. But even so, back in my 20s, I've been able to reflect on what I did do right. I never, ever lost contact with her. I listened to her. I didn't judge her, and I went where she was comfortable. I entered her world. I sat with her in her little park. I never criticized her. I kept most of what I was feeling to myself. Mental illness can create a wall, and so we can become consumed with trying to fix a person. And by doing so, we can lose sight of their beauty, the person's soul. So when I think about the shelter years, if I could do anything differently other than advocating for her, I would have asked her more questions. Why did she love the ballet so much? What was it like to work with Avedon and Scavullo? When did I take my first steps? She might not have been able to do many things for me as a mother then, but I think she would have enjoyed answering those questions. When she talked about planets colliding, I wish I had been more empathetic. Wow, it must be so stressful worrying about the planets colliding. I'm sorry that weighs on your mind so heavily. You can't argue with someone who is mentally ill or experiencing psychosis, but you can show that you care. In a perfect world, I would love to have seen my mother handing out programs at Lincoln Center or volunteering at the library for performing arts. She was there anyway. It was something that would have made her feel valued. My mother was a kind person who wanted to help others. She was always talking about miracles. She sat in her little square every day, believing that if she did, the square would one day be elevated to a shrine for humanity. This is a photo of her in that square. And this is the face of untreated mental illness. This is what happens without treatment, medication, or resources. And it's also the reason for me why I feel it's so important to support organizations like NAMI. I'm currently on the board of NAMI Westchester and just started serving as secretary on the board as well. The stigma and neglect of mental illness is not just an unmet public health problem. It's a social injustice, no different than intolerance of sexual orientation, religious prejudice, or racial discrimination. Mental health conditions deserve the same respect as any health condition. I wrote my book with the intent of helping others. If sharing my mother's story achieves this goal, then perhaps that will be the miracle that she was praying for. I can't change the sadness of her life, but I can help others in her name. And one of those people is my daughter, Nicole. Learning to advocate for Nicole helped me advocate for my mother. And now, coming full circle, this journey has put me in places where I'm in a better position to help my daughter. If you know of anybody, or for those of you who have a family member with a serious mental illness, I offer this for your consideration. Until I embarked on my journey, I didn't know that mental illness had affected so many people around me. Because I opened up, they opened up. It was hard for me to break through the shame of having a mother who was mentally ill, the shame of never going to school, and the shame of having a mother who lived in a shelter. But for anyone out there who has a story to tell, every story matters, and I can tell you that I've been met with kindness every step of the way. The experience has brought me gifts I could never have imagined, a family I never knew, new friendships. I just this past week received a box. It was from my mother's cousin that she grew up with. This was the closest person to her growing up. She was in her 90s. She passed away earlier this year, and her daughter sent me a box, huge box. And I didn't know it was coming. I opened it up, and the first thing I see, letters that my mother sent to her from 1948 to 1985. She had her plane ticket when she was sent to Hollywood for a screen test with Howard Hughes, postcards from when she was in the wedding in Monaco, a postcard from when she first moved to the Barbizon, vintage clothing that my mother had sent her. Just, I could go on and on. This is a very large box, and it was just amazing. Tear sheets I had never seen. This cousin did an amazing thing. She loved her so much that when she found out that she was living in a shelter in 1989 and the Star article broke, she was working at a university. I think she was an art teacher, and she described it as just grabbing, a pad and markers and starting to sketch out a different ending to my mother's life. And she literally wrote a book, a fully fledged book that could have been a movie. It's amazing. And I just finished it. That was at the bottom of this amazing box. So I think people don't realize when you write a memoir, like, it's not over when you finish the book. This continues. And, this past, let's see, it was last September, I was interviewed for a documentary about Grace's life in honor of her 90th birthday that has aired in France. It has not aired in the US yet, but that aired in France a couple, maybe 2 months ago, so that will be soon. In last January, I started filming for a documentary based on the Bridesmaid's daughter, and we had to stop for obvious reasons because that was January, and we all know what March brought. So we're kind of on hold until this spring, but I'm really looking forward to continuing with that because there are some pretty amazing visuals to share. And, I just, imagine the difference for my mother today had there been resources like there are now. So thank you so much for listening. And, I'm really happy to answer any questions that you might have. I can stop.
Carolyn, Nyna,
Yes.
I thank you so much. That was really a very, very interesting talk and makes me even more eager to read the book. But I have a question about postpartum psychosis, which I had never really heard and don't have a lot of knowledge about. Can that also happen perhaps after a miscarriage also?
I think that, yes, those symptoms. I'm not a health expert, so, or an
Right.
OBGYN, but it is my understanding too that, a lot of complications, mental health complications can arise after a miscarriage and
And a hysterectomy and you grew up then out the first few years of your life out on Long Island?
Yes.
Where?
Huntington, Lloyd Harbor, Lloyd Neck, actually, on the water, just an idyllic, beautiful setting. My parents built, their dream house on Long Island, although I don't think it quite ended up that way for my mother because it meant for her that she had to give up her career. For her to get to New York City, she had to drive 7 miles to the train station. And then she, before that, had to pick up a babysitter, take her back to the house. It didn't work. She did try. It was too much.
It had to be a 3-hour trek.
Yeah. Yeah.
By the time she finished with the babysitter and drop off and then getting to the train. And I think the train at that point was probably a good hour and 45 minutes into the city. So
It was
sure.
a long ride. Yeah.
Yeah, that was.
But for my father, it was fine. He had an office in the city. He would stay over, and he had his best friend who, Sherman Fairchild, lived next door to us. And there would be these glamorous parties every weekend. And at a certain point, my mother just wanted to be a mother. She didn't want to go to those types of events, didn't feel comfortable. It was all the new young models, and she felt like she'd been replaced. So it was very difficult. And my father was, he was not faithful, and I can't even imagine what that must have felt like for her. So she had so many risk factors, and often I think that's what it is. It's not any one thing, and someone doesn't become homeless just for one reason. It's a series of events that just sort of unravel someone's life, and definitely mental illness plays a big role.
And your siblings?
They're both deceased. So I had 2 sisters, 6 and 8 years older than me. They led a very different life. You could say they led a charmed life. They had the dance lessons, the horseback riding lessons. They did swim meets. They that just was not my life, because by the time I was born, she wasn't well. And so it was completely different for me. And a lot of her fears, were projected onto me. So.
Yeah. And actually it was 6 years later too. So.
Yeah.
Sure. Definitely. Anyone else have any questions?
Why is this coming off?
Something happened to my screen.
Yeah, what's going on with the Zoom thing?
Well, I can tell you, my sister-in-law, after the birth of her 6th child and having her tubes tied, went into postpartum depression. She would not leave the house. She would not go grocery shopping. My brother had to do everything. And she never really recovered, but she was not as severely inhibited as your mother seems to have been.
Yeah, it's more common than you realize when you start talking to people. And it's the sad thing too, is that it really can be, it's something that can be treated. So we need to all be more aware and watch out for the mothers around us, and make sure they're okay. And
am I the only one who sees these big flowers and things? What?
No, I'm seeing orchids, pink orchids.
At least they're pretty flowers.
But what's going on? Where is everybody?
But I can see our speaker.
Yes, I see her too.
I don't know. I think maybe Derek maybe have gotten on because he's the only other one who could get on screen besides me.
Well, I think the program is very interesting, and I'm glad to have, quote, met her and look forward to reading her book.
Thank you. Yeah, and if anybody's interested in purchasing a signed copy, or for the holidays, anything like that, it's $20 a copy and no shipping. And we'd make arrangements to get it there or to get it to you. So just
right. Where do you live now?
So we moved to Ridgefield, Connecticut in August, and we're loving it. We're on Lake Mamanesco, and it's beautiful. And you know, we have 6 children between us, with the youngest being 29. So
Wow.
it was time for a little bit of a downsize, but yeah, we're just loving where we are.
Where were you before?
In Pound Ridge for
yes.
15 years, and before that, White Plains. Yeah.
May I ask, what was your mother's name when she was modeling and doing all these things?
Sure. Yeah, so her maiden name was Carolyn Schaffner, but they encouraged her to change it to Carolyn Scott, which was a really very pretty working name. So that was her modeling name, Carolyn Scott.
Carolyn Scott.
Yes. Mhm.
Interesting. Well, I see those flowers very clearly here.
Well, thank you very much for sharing this.
Oh,
Very,
thank
very
you.
interesting.
Thank you for having me and taking an interest. You know, I really
And
appreciate it.
All the best to you, and I think I have to sign off.
Okay.
Thank you.
I am hoping I'm going to ask Jessica to perhaps send out an email with information on how to order and buy the book.
Sure.
And
Absolutely.
we'll do that. But thank you again, Nyna, for appearing. It was very insightful.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And my best to everybody there. I hope you have a wonderful holiday.
Thank you.
And to you.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
signing
All
off.
right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.